When I was given this topic, Talmud Matters, I was a little surprised. And I'd like to offer a conjecture as to why this topic is being discussed specifically now. You may know that 1 week from today, there's going to be a massive event in the New York area, the Siyum Hashas, the celebration of the completion of the study of the entire Talmud in the system of Daf Yomi, in which a single page of Talmud is studied every day, day after day after day. It takes about 7.5 years to complete the cycle. And there's going to be a massive celebration in New York City, in MetLife Stadium in the Meadowlands, which seats about 90,000 people. And there's an overflow venue in an arena in Brooklyn, Barclays Center, which seats another 20,000. It will be electronically linked. So in those two venues, there'll be approximately 110,000 Jews celebrating the completion of the Talmud. Now, this is a source of immense pride for the religious community because it demonstrates the explosive growth in that community. If you go back as recently as the 8th Siyum Hashas, this is the 13th. So go back to the 8th, which took place in 1982. It was held in the Felt Forum, which is next to Madison Square Garden. 5,000 people were in attendance. And at the time, that was considered unbelievable. 5,000 people should come to celebrate the completion of the Talmud. And then the next cycle moved to Madison Square Garden and on and on and on until it reached this massive celebration. And every 7.5 years, you hear the same story. And the story goes something like this, that one of the organizers, not of the program itself, but one of the professional staff of the given arena, whether it's Madison Square Garden or MetLife Center, expresses his disbelief. How is it possible that 90,000 people, or whatever the number was, are gathering together to celebrate the completion of a book? To come for a sporting event, football, that we understand. Basketball, we understand. Hockey, we understand. A concert, that we understand. But that 90,000 people should gather to celebrate the completion of a book? That is unfathomable. And yet, it happens. And the joy is beyond description. Of the 90,000 people there, okay, I don't think all 90,000 have completed the entire Talmud over this 7.5 year period. But I think it's safe to say that there'll be a couple of tens of thousands of people there that have. And these are people that have gotten up early in the morning. They stayed up late at night to study the Talmud, day after day after day, not missing a day. Not for Yom Kippur, and not for Purim, and not for any Jewish holiday. They keep up with it, whatever is going on in their lives. But that page of Talmud, they are committed to. And it's not just the individual. The entire family has to make sacrifices. If the head of household is making that type of commitment in terms of time, everyone else is affected. So his spouse and his children, his parents, they're all participants in the celebration. And it's an amazing, amazing, amazing thing. So anybody that hears about this event who doesn't already know what Talmud is probably very curious. What is Talmud, and why does it make such a difference? Why is it so important in people's lives? Well, let's talk about the Torah itself and Torah study. One of the 613 commandments in the Torah is to study Torah. There are many mitzvahs. You have to give charity, and you have to pray, and you have to observe Passover, eat kosher, many, many mitzvahs. One of them is the mitzvah to study Torah. That mitzvah, in rabbinic tradition, is considered kineged kulam. It is greater than all other mitzvahs put together. So why is it so important? Why is study so important? Why is it the hallmark of a Jew? Well, the simple answer is because if you don't study, you don't know what to do. You can't perform the other 612 mitzvahs unless you do this mitzvah. Unless you learn, you're not going to know how to live as a Jew. You can't observe the Sabbath unless you learn about the Sabbath, learn its laws. You can't keep kosher unless you learn the laws of keeping kosher. You can't properly give charity unless you learn the laws of giving charity. So learning Torah is a necessary step in living as a Jew, doing all the other mitzvahs. That's the short answer, and it certainly is 100% true. Now, Torah has two components. We have Torah shebichsav, which is the written Torah, and we have the Torah sheba'al peh, we have the oral tradition. When God gave the Torah to Moses on Mount Sinai, there were two halves. First, there was the text of the Torah, the text. And take any verse in the Torah which lays down a law. You have the text of the law. So, to give one small example, every Jewish home has a mezuzah on the doorpost, a little container that has a parchment scroll with chapters from the Torah. It's a mezuzah. The wording in the Torah is uchesaftam al mezuzos veisecha uvisharecha. You shall write them on the doorposts of your houses and your gates. 5 words. That's it. But those 5 words don't give us a lot of information. You should write them. Write what? It seems to be a reference to some chapter of the Torah, but it isn't explicit. And what does it mean to write it on the doorpost? Because I would have taken that to mean that you actually write it on the doorpost. You take ink and you write it on the wood or the metal of the doorpost. And yet we don't do that. We write it on a parchment scroll, and we put it in a container, and we attach the container to the doorpost. How do we know to do that? And how is that scroll written? Is there a special way it's written? You can just write it in your regular handwriting? The material on which it's written, can it be just plain paper? Does it have to be the parchment that comes from an animal skin? A lot of details over here. So we know that when God gave the Torah to Moshe, there was the text, which ultimately was committed to writing, and that's called the Torah shebichsav. And there's also the oral commentary to it, the explanation, the definitions, the guidelines, the rules that supplement the text. And that is called the Torah sheba'al peh. That is called the oral law. And the Talmud tells us that the written Torah is meant to be studied from a written text. And the oral Torah is meant to be preserved as oral Torah. Devarim shebichsav iyata rashay l'imrum ba'al peh. The written Torah cannot be recited from memory. It has to be studied from a text. And Devarim sheba'al peh iyata rashay l'kaisvan. And the oral tradition really should not be written down at all. Its oral flavor should be maintained. And there are reasons for this. You see, that which is written down, there's a lot of information that is conveyed by the way it is written beyond the simple meaning of the words. When you have a verse in the Torah, sometimes there are understandings that come from its juxtaposition to that which comes before and that which follows. So when you recite that verse orally, it loses all context. It is disconnected from that which came before and that which follows. When you read it from a text, you see that it is a verse embedded between two bookends. There is something that comes before, and there's something which comes after. When you say it orally, that isn't readily apparent. And this is very, very important. There are many laws which are derived from context. So a text which has a context has to be studied in a manner that preserves the context. And that's the idea that the written law should be studied from a written text. Oral laws have their own quality. One of them is that they allow for creativity. They allow for originality. You see, part of the Torah Shebaal Peh isn't just the body of oral traditions that were passed down from Moshe generation after generation to us. Part of the oral tradition is the tradition of creativity, innovation. The great minds applying themselves to new situations, new circumstances, new considerations, and deriving from the age-old wisdom new applications. If everything would be committed to writing, that would be impossible, because everything would then just be written down, and that's all we would have. The oral nature of Torah allows for the idea of chidushei Torah, creativity, original interpretation, addressing new problems in creative, original ways. And therefore, the two aspects of Torah have to be preserved as they were meant to be preserved. The problem was, and this is a historical problem, that there were times that the Torah was in danger of being forgotten. Jews lived through difficult times, persecutions at the hands of the Romans, go back about 2,000 years, and there was a danger that the Torah Shebaal Peh, that the oral Torah would be forgotten. And there was a great rabbi, his name was Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, and Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi took a bold step. And I wonder if it wasn't controversial at the time. A bold step of taking the oral tradition and for the first time in history committing it to writing and creating a text from which the oral tradition would be studied. And that was the Mishnah. And this was written about, I would say the year 150 before the, year 150. And this was the first work of the oral tradition that was committed to writing. It is an outline. It is a skeleton. There's no way to commit the entire oral tradition to writing. It's really nothing more than a summary. And as much as is there, there's an astounding amount of things that are left out and taken for granted. Just to make mention of this fact, it's an amazing thing that in the Mishnah, there is no mention of the laws of Hanukkah. The laws of Hanukkah, the holiday which we're currently celebrating, is not mentioned in the Mishnah. There are two references to Hanukkah, but only in the context of other laws. For example, let's say a person puts his Hanukkah menorah in the doorway, and an animal passes by and kicks it over, and a fire results. What is the liability of the owner of the animal, and what is the liability of the person who put the menorah in the street? That has nothing to do per se with the laws of Hanukkah. But here we have the relevance of the laws of Hanukkah to a law of civil liability. Talmud says an amazing thing. There's a consideration over here. You see, if I am walking through the street with my donkey, as a rule, I don't have to concern myself that there might be a candle in someone's doorway. Normally, why would I expect such a thing? So therefore, if someone put the candle out, we would say that person is liable. But when it comes to Hanukkah, since everyone lights in the doorway, So now this is something that the donkey owner should expect, and perhaps that shifts the liability to him. He should be more careful. So the Mishnah talks about Hanukkah with reference to the liability for knocking over the flame. Another place it mentions Hanukkah with regards to the mitzvah of bringing the first fruits. There's an annual observance. The first fruits are brought to the temple. Until when is this performed? The Mishnah says until Hanukkah. So it's simply that the date is mentioned, but not with regards to the laws of lighting the menorah, recitation of Hallel. It's just an amazing thing. Not everything is mentioned there. There's a lot which is taken for granted. And perhaps the most familiar laws aren't cited there. But it's really a way of recalling, triggering memory. But the oral flavor is still maintained. And the Vilna Gaon once said an amazing thing, that there are difficult passages in the Mishnah. And sometimes you have to reconcile them with creative thinking. You'll come across a Mishnah which seems to contradict another Mishnah, and we'll point out that each one is talking about a different case, slightly different case, which makes all the difference in terms of the application of the law. So that's how we reconcile the contradiction, and yet it would have been nicer if the Mishnah would have helped us and told us that this Mishnah is speaking about such a case and this Mishnah is speaking about a different case. It doesn't. Why? Because, says the Vilna Gaon, it wanted that the Mishnah should remain an oral text, something that would require discussion and commentary and explanation and mentorship under a more experienced scholar. And therefore, it was an amazing thing that Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, Rabbi Yehuda the Prince, wrote a text which maintains the oral flavor, and that's the Mishnah. A couple hundred years later, the interpretation of the Mishnah was now challenged. There was a danger that the correct interpretation of the Mishnah would be forgotten. So there were several sages, the names were Ravina and Ravashi, who decided to compile all the discussions that had taken place over several hundred years that pertain to the Mishnah. The commentaries, the explanations, the reconciliations, supplementary material, new inquiries that can be resolved by reference to the Mishnah. And that's what the Talmud is. And the Gemara, which is another term used for the Talmud, is really unlike any other work imaginable. You read a book, it is the product of a single author conveying a single straightforward idea, or maybe a multitude of ideas, but in a fairly straightforward way. The Talmud is discussion, it is debate. Sometimes it seems that most of the questions are left hanging, unresolved, contradictory, enigmatic. Not a single voice speaking, but hundreds of voices speaking. Some rabbis of the Talmud are more familiar, because there are certain rabbis who come up again and again and again, usually in pairs. So, for example, Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, his brother-in-law, they come up very often, always together in a pair. Rav and Shmuel come up always together as a pair. Rabbah and Rabbi Yosef, often as a pair. Abaye and Rava, often as a pair. And that's to be expected, because since the Talmud is discussion, it isn't the product of a single person sitting in isolation, meditating, contemplating. It's a function of the vigorous debate, the back and forth, the argument. And that's what Talmud is all about. It's the discussion, the debate, the analysis. Now, it's interesting that once works of the oral tradition became permitted and could be committed to writing, we have later works as well. So there is commentary to the Talmud. So if you open a Talmud, it's not pure Talmud. You'll discover that on the inside margin, you have the commentary of Rashi that was written in the 1000s. On the outer margin, you have the commentary of the authors of the Tosafos, which are the addenda to Rashi. And there are volumes and volumes and volumes of commentary, to the extent that in Talmud, there are pages of Talmud where there may be just several lines of the Talmud itself, and most of it is commentary. And the interesting thing about the commentary is that the commentary carries the discussion and the debate and the analysis forward. It's not different, it's just there's more progress. So the same types of issues that were argued in the Talmud are now argued in the commentators. So Rashi will take one stand, and the authors of the Tosfos, many of whom were family members, took a different stand. And in later opinions, the debate will be analyzed and reanalyzed and reanalyzed. And to the extent that the commentary also becomes an integral part of the Talmud itself. And later, you have this yearning to codify and to try to tie the loose ends. And there were various attempts. Maimonides, the Rambam, was probably one of the earliest. And he said, I'm going to decide on all the unresolved issues and write a code of law which gives definitive answers based on the Talmud. And we would think that's great. That cuts out all the work. We don't have to listen to the argumentation and the debate. We have the final answer. And yet, in the Rambam's time, this was considered terribly controversial. His critic, Rabbi Avram ben David, the Ravid, was very, very emphatic in rejecting this. He said that Maimonides departed from the manner of scholarship by not giving us the argumentation, not giving us the proofs, not giving us the names to attribute the rulings, by speaking as if he is the sole authority. That's not the Jewish way. Then there were other codifications. Ultimately, we have what's called the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, written by Rabbi Yosef Karo in the 1500s. And we consider this the final codification of Jewish law, but of course, it has its own body of commentary, to the extent that if you open a volume of Shulchan Aruch, it looks like a volume of Talmud, just different commentators. So nothing is ever ultimately resolved. And today you have modern works that try to do the same type of codification, and undoubtedly the time will come that there will be commentaries written to those works as well. So why do we stick with the Talmud? It seems that the Talmud is smack in the middle of a process. We start with the text of the Torah. We have an oral tradition, which was committed to writing in the Mishnah. We have the argumentation in the Talmud. We have a body of commentary. Ultimately, we have a final codification. Well, if the purpose of learning Torah is to know what to do, what would the best way of knowing what to do be? Refer to the latest codification, and that'll give you a final ruling. Why would we want to go back to the middle of the process and look at the Talmud? I think the answer is this. Very simple answer. Let's say you want to understand a building. A building. Let's say this building. So you come as a visitor to this building, you look around, you look at the pillars, you look at the windows, the light fixtures, the doors, the furniture. You have an appreciation of the building. You think you understand why things are the way they are, why it was built this way, why it was furnished this way, why it was decorated this way. But compare your understanding of the building to a person who was involved in the process from the beginning. The architect who drew the plans, who consulted with the building committee and the membership to make the fundamental decisions as to how the building should be built, what it should feature, who followed it through the process of construction, all the obstacles, dealing with City Hall, getting zoning, getting permits, the person who watched the building evolve and develop what broke down, what had to be repaired, the various renovations that took place over the years. If there'd be one person who would have overseen and been engaged in that process from beginning to end, his understanding of the building would be infinitely greater than the understanding of the person who looks at the building in its current form and thinks he understands what's going on. He says that is the attraction of Talmud. For a person who wants to know the Jewish law, which really means wanting to know what God wants in a given situation, says the process is everything. It's not the final answer. It's not the final answer. It's working it through from the very beginning through all the steps of analysis and debate and discussion until its final conclusion. The Talmud itself, the Gemara itself, is an indispensable step. You cannot really understand if you skip that intermediate step. And that's the attraction of Talmud. Now, it's ironic that because Talmud is so difficult, sometimes to clarify a single point may take days and days and days of study, maybe months of study. So now you have a problem. If you have to spend months of study, so how are you going to have the broad knowledge of all the things you have to know as a Jew? If you try to follow this process of starting from the beginning and working your way through, there's not enough time to master everything. So for that, we rely on the codifications. For that, you'll open a Shulchan Aruch to find out what you have to do. But to the real scholar, whenever he opens a Shulchan Aruch without the background, he feels like he's reading the Cliff Notes. He's cheating. He's really cheating. Sometimes you have to cheat. Sometimes, if there's something you need to have read, so the Cliff Notes is the best way to do it. If time is of the essence and you're having a final and you haven't read the book, then you do what's second best. So likewise, a Jew needs to know what to do. So he'll take out a Shulchan Aruch with its commentators and he'll find the answer. Maybe nowadays you can look it up on the internet, and sure enough, he'll do the right thing. But it's always with a sense of having cut corners. That's not the way we're meant to do it. We're really meant to do it is to go through that process of painstaking analysis and debate and discussion and argumentation. And it's an interesting thing that when you go into a place where Talmud is studied, it is not the public library. You know, you go into a library and everyone, shh. They tell a story of a person that went to a librarian and said, "Can I have a donut?" And the librarian said, "Shh, this is a library." And the person said, "Shh, can I have a donut?" A public library is where you study in silence. It's quiet, serene, because you study in isolation. Go into a yeshiva, into a beis medrash where Talmud is studied as it should be studied. It's like trying to study on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. People are screaming at each other, and they're arguing. And by the way, I'll mention something else interesting, that once upon a time, when people were more passionate about their study, they would call each other names too. If one person advanced a theory that wasn't rigorous, his colleague, his partner would say, "Du bist a Pferd." In Yiddish, "You're a horse." That was considered a big insult. "Bist a Pferd." And we'll say, "Du bist a Poyer." You're a peasant. We call each other names. Now, it's an amazing thing. My father-in-law, of blessed memory, he passed away. He was very, very old. He was in his 90s. And he studied Talmud to his last days. And he had a study partner who was also a very old man. But they were students in the great yeshivas of Europe. So when they would study together, And they'd get heated in their argument, they'd call each other names. Now, my wife is one of 4 daughters, 4 girls in the family. So the girls are very, very proper and refined. And when her father and his partner would call each other names, they'd become very terribly upset about that. And my father-in-law would tell her, this is how we learned in yeshiva. Says it made a difference. We were passionate, we were engaged. Sometimes the men got to call someone a name, call them a name. You got to set them straight. Can't let them get away with shallow ideas. That's what Talmud is all about. And that's why people are engaged in it. That's why people attach themselves to it. And there's an interesting thing. You may have stumbled across a number of years ago, not so many years ago, there were articles, it was reported that in South Korea, there are tens of thousands of people studying Talmud. Now it happens to be, as all things are, this is a great exaggeration. It's not really what happened. What happened was that there was a rabbi who was a chaplain in Japan in the 60s, I believe. And he wrote a little book of aphorisms in the Talmud, and someone translated it into Japanese. Now, he has no idea whether the translation was accurate because he doesn't speak Japanese. And somehow someone in South Korea got a hold of this Japanese book and he translated it into Korean, and it became a bestseller. So they're not really studying the Talmud, they're studying this translation of a Japanese book about Talmud. But it became a bestseller and thousands of people bought the book, and there are other books, and Talmud is a big thing. But what is true is that South Korea is a country similar to Japan where education is very, very, very important. And they have these academies where the young kids are grilled for hours and hours and hours, very competitive, big exams necessary to get into the finest universities. And they're all looking for a learning technique that is going to give them an edge, give them an advantage. And someone heard that in Israel, people study Talmud with partners, study partners. It's called chavrusa. And they argue and they debate, and they really carry forward the Talmudic analysis in modern times. And they thought, wow, this is a fabulous idea. And some of the academies in South Korea have embraced this method of chavrusa learning in the various subjects that they emphasize, because they realize that there's something to it. It's very, very interesting. So they're not really studying Talmud, but they did borrow some things from us. What's very interesting is that the Talmud tells us an amazing thing. It says that the covenant that God made with the Jewish people was made over the oral law, over the Torah Shebaal Peh, not over the written law. It's a very cryptic statement that the covenant that God made with the Jewish people was over the oral law. And I think it means the following. A written text is available to everybody. The Sefer Torah is there in the Ark. Anyone that wants can take it out, read it, try to understand it. It's not particularly Jewish. It's available to everybody. And by the way, maybe this is the best place to say this, that's exactly what happened to the Torah. Who borrowed the Torah and tried to make it theirs? The Christian world. But the Christian world has a New Testament, but they haven't rejected the Old Testament, meaning they've taken our Bible and they've made it theirs. Of course, they've added the New Testament and in the process corrupted the Old, but you ask them, they still assert the claim that they are devoted to the Old Scripture to some extent. And that's only possible because it was accessible, it's available, it's open for everybody. The Torah Shebaal Peh The oral tradition is uniquely Jewish. That's the unique relationship that we have with God. Even in South Korea, they're only studying about the Talmud. They're not studying Talmud. That's the relationship. That's the covenant. That binds us to God himself. The Maimonides writes a commentary to a very, very interesting Talmudic story. The Talmud says there was a great sage, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. He was the junior of the 80 disciples of Hillel. Hillel, the great sage Hillel, had 80 disciples. The most senior was named Rabbi Yonasan ben Uziel. He was so holy that when he would study Torah, a bird flying over his head would be burnt to a crisp. Why would that be? So Rashi says, because the angels, the fiery angels, came to hear him studying Torah. So above his head there were fiery angels. So the bird fly through the airspace, he'd be roasted in the process. That was Yonas ben Uziel. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was the youngest of the 80. He was the most junior of the 80. What does the Talmud say about him? He knew everything. Scripture and Mishnah and Talmud. He knew interpretations of the Torah, calculating the calendar, numerology, conversations of angels, conversations of trees. He knew everything. Knew everything. He didn't ignore a davar gadol or a davar katan. Not a great thing and not a small thing. So the Gemara says, what does it mean, not a great thing and not a small thing? So it says, not a great thing was Maisa Merkava, the mystical tradition of the chariot of God. He didn't overlook that. He covered that. What was the small thing? The small thing is Havayas to Rava V'Abaya. The inquiries of Abaya and Rava, what we call Talmud. That was a small thing. Now, a lot of people think this. You speak to a person about studying Torah, the person says, what? I'm going to study Talmud? What does Talmud talk about? Talmud talks about if a bull gores an ox or a cow, what is his liability? Well, that's important if you live in an agrarian society and bulls do gore cows. You need to know what the liability is, but I mean, these aren't sublime religious ideas. But if we would study the mystical tradition, if we would study the divine chariot, theological, philosophical speculation, that would bring us closer to God, wouldn't it? So that's davar gadol. That's something which is very, very big. And davar katan, something small, are the types of issues that Talmud deals with. So the Rambam writes that interpretation may be correct, but nevertheless, Talmud should not be dismissed. And he gives several reasons. Number one, because you need to know Talmud to know what to do, as we already discussed. But secondly, he says, Talmud is miyashev daito shel adam. It settles a person's mind. It teaches a person how to think. And this is an amazing thing about Talmud. You know, we go to big rabbis, and we ask them all sorts of questions. We ask them questions about business, questions about public policy, all sorts of questions. And you have to wonder sometimes, what qualifies them to answer these questions? I mean, they've studied Talmud, so they are experts on points of Jewish law, but if we ask them a business question, advice, what should I buy and sell in my store, or a political decision, what qualifies them to answer this? And the simple answer is that Torah, especially Talmud, has an amazing virtue, that it settles a person's mind. It trains a person to think. And if your mind is trained, then you can use that trained mind to analyze any situation. You want to know how to deal with your children? You want to know whether we should be supportive of the government or not supportive of the government? Do you need to know how to run a business? Do you need to know how to run a school? So the trained Talmudic mind is equipped to do those things because this process of analysis, this process of debate and discussion, viewing an issue from all angles, facilitates the settling of the mind. But the hour is late. I just want to mention one thing which is important to know, that learning Torah is not only an intellectual thing. It's not just now you know what to do or you've sharpened your mind. It's also a religious act. And, imagine two people have a relationship. And you want to know, are they close? Are they really close or not, these two people? A young man, a young woman, maybe they're contemplating marriage. Are they really close? Do they really get it? Like, one of the tests would be, do they see things the same way, or do they see things differently? When their thought processes begin to align, when this young man begins to think like the young woman, when the young woman begins to think like the young man, so you know that they're beginning to converge, they're beginning to get closer. Now, by the way, this has a drawback too, because sometimes it's very good that the two people in a relationship should see things differently, because you can avoid a lot of difficulty. But I think the point is something which we all understand, that when you begin to share values and you begin to think alike and see things the same way and have a common attitude, that is a sign of closeness. It says we want to bond with God. We want to be close to God. Part of that means to begin to think like God. We want to think like God thinks. And that's not so easy. The verse says, Ki lo machshavosai machshavosechem. My thoughts aren't like your thoughts. The thoughts of God are inscrutable. We can't understand how God is thinking. In fact, the author of the Tanya says an amazing thing. He says, really, what is Torah? Torah is the wisdom of God. It's the wisdom of God, the knowledge of God. Really, we should not be able to understand it at all. A human being should understand God's thinking. But what God did was, because he wanted to establish a relationship with us, he stepped down the current. You have high-tension wires, 50,000 volts, carrying electricity across the province. But the voltage is too high. You can't plug your lamp into a 50,000 volt electric line. So there's a transformer. The transformer steps the current down from 50,000 volts to 5,000 volts, down to 1,000 volts, and down to 200, finally to 110. That's the current that you access in your electrical socket, and into that you can plug in your lamp. This process of stepping down facilitates, enables us to utilize that electricity, which is being transmitted at a much higher voltage. In a sense, it's the same thing. Since God's wisdom is unfathomable, but God wanted us to have a connection. He wanted that we should think like him. So what he did was he stepped down the current. He reduced it. He simplified it. Instead of being abstract, philosophical, or theological concepts, he made it concrete. We deal with real-life issues. And by the way, when I say real-life issues, I'll give an example from the Talmud that will illustrate the point. Imagine, says the Talmud, the following scenario. You have two people walking in the street. One of them is carrying a beam, a wooden beam. The other is carrying a barrel of wine. And let's say the person with the barrel is in front. So the beam runs into the barrel, smashes the barrel. Who's liable? Well, let's analyze the case. Says the Talmud, if the person carrying the barrel stopped short, he's at fault. He didn't give the person with the beam enough time to stop. If, on the other hand, the person with the beam sped up and ran into the barrel, then the person carrying the beam is liable. Very logical, and you can figure out yourself in reversing it. Let's say the beam is in front and the barrel is in back, then the opposite rules apply. So anybody reading this text would say, okay, what's the relevance here? I never saw anybody carrying a beam down the street and never saw a person carrying a barrel down the street. What's the issue? But when you think about it for about 5 seconds, you realize that this is the law that should pertain to a rear-end collision. When one car runs into another car on the road, this is the same issue. Right? If the car in front made a sudden stop, then he's at fault. If the car in back sped up, then he's at fault. So nowadays, for various reasons, there's a default assumption that the person in back is always liable. But you think about it for a second, you realize it's not really the case. It's not really the case. It should really depend on this analysis. So the Talmud is speaking about the law of rear-end collisions before the car was invented, because it's really the same principle. So God could have given his wisdom as something abstract, something philosophical, something arcane, but he reduced it and stepped the current down, dressed it in concrete terms to make it accessible to us, so that we have the opportunity to think like God thinks, come close to him, and become attached to him. And the author of the Tanya says this is the meaning of a famous Talmudic statement. It says that Torah is compared to water. Because just like water goes from a high place to a low place, so Torah goes from a high place to a low place. Now, normally we understand it this way, that to be a student of Torah, you have to be humble. You have to be humble. If you are a know-it-all, you're not going to learn anything. So a person is a low person, a humble person, and he'll master Torah. But the author of the Tanya understands it this way, that the Torah itself starts in a high place. It starts in God's mind. And it flows downward, 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 downward. It becomes simplified. It becomes more concrete, more down to earth, to the extent that even we can understand it. But when we do it, it's a religious act. We become attached, and we become close to God. And that's why we study. We don't only study to know what to do, and we don't only study to sharpen our minds. We study because this is the way in which we become attached to God himself. And to study with passion, with rigor, that it isn't simply, okay, that's what he says, but that it should make a difference. That means really engaging with the subject matter, that you argue, that you debate, that you have to defend a position that you take. That's what Talmud is all about. It matters. It matters. It makes a big difference. On the sheet, there's a lot of material that we didn't cover, but if you're interested, you can pursue it. But I would say that I have a better idea. Rather than even reading these source materials, take a volume of Talmud out. And today we have resources for this, which are unbelievable. There are translations of the entire Talmud that can guide a person step by step. Now, it doesn't have that flavor of Talmud if it's pre-digested for you, but it's a good place to start. And open a page and get a taste of it. It matters. It makes a difference. And hopefully, one thing will lead to the next. And maybe someday you'll find yourself in the Beis Medrash calling your partner a horse. To put it that way. And when that happens, you think, oh, that's a terrible thing. That's really, you've devolved, and now you're attacking your study partner ad hominem. It's not true. So when you reach that point that your study of Torah makes a difference to you, that it's not simply something you read, but it's something you live and you're engaged with, that's a sign of tremendous success and tremendous accomplishment. So thank you very much for allowing me to share some ideas with you today, and hopefully this should be a great new year, 2020, for increased Torah study. Chazak ve'amatz, be strong and courageous, and hopefully the Ribbon Shalom God will guide your studies in productive ways. Thank you for listening.